If you are a teacher, parent, administrator, student, and/or anyone who loves reconnecting children with nature, and you want to figure out how to cultivate learning gardens and nature-based curriculum, then this is the podcast, the Outdoor Classrooms Podcast. My name is Victoria Hackett. I am the founder of Outdoor-Classrooms.com and the Secret Gardens Nature Classes. I love witnessing the magic that happens when children are playfully learning outdoors. Observing the return of wonder and curiosity when children are interacting with nature is pure magic. This is the podcast that is going to help you capture children's interest and give you not only inspiration, but some real life strategies that are going to help you figure out how to use the outdoor space, your outdoor space, as a teaching tool, so you can enlighten the playful learning experience for young children. Welcome to our Outdoor Classrooms community. Attention educators, elevate your teaching with our Outdoor Classrooms Teacher Certification Program. Start with our engaging outdoor teaching bootcamp and dive into our 4 informative seasonal masterclasses that focus in on our 4 different types of teaching gardens. This is all included in the Circle membership for just $27 a month. Complete your journey with our comprehensive capstone course available separately at an early bird price of $450. Start the Outdoor Teaching Bootcamp today as a self-paced hybrid course. For those who have completed all the prerequisites, begin the capstone course starting on September 4th. And don't forget that early bird price. Take the next step in transforming education, enroll today, and bring the classroom outdoors. Today we have a very special guest, Andy Webster. Andy is a New York State certified earth science teacher with a decade of experience as a public school science teacher. In 2017, Andy left the traditional classroom setting to begin the Walden Project, a full-time outdoor education program for teenagers based at the Cumming Nature Center in Naples, New York, that is inspired by the Henry Thoreau's famous sojourn to Walden Pond. The program is now entering its 7th year. Outside of teaching, Andy and his partner Maggie have 4 children and a small organic farm. Without further ado, Andy Webster. Hey there, Andy. Welcome to the Outdoor Classrooms Podcast. I am absolutely thrilled that you are here. I'm more thrilled because you are an educator that works with high school students. So I am absolutely so glad that our paths have crossed because we've been focusing so much on early childhood that I'm thrilled that you have this incredible story to share with our community. So welcome to the Outdoor Classrooms Podcast.
Thanks, Victoria. I'm psyched to be here. I listen to this podcast all the time, and so this is great.
Oh, wonderful. So I want to backpedal a little bit and have you share a little bit about who you are, where you've come from, and how you came to the Walden Project. And then we'll talk about specifically the Walden Project.
Sure. A little bit about where I come from. So I actually grew up in Massachusetts, not far from where you are. And as I was growing up, I always found kind of a peace being in nature. But I would say, so that was one sort of core founding experience was just, and for me, I remember walking through the woods and I didn't know one tree from the next, but there was just a feeling that I really enjoyed about being there. When I went through public school, and school was something where I felt like it was an endurance contest. I felt like I used to dread getting up for school in the morning. And so after I graduated from school, I spent some time walking on the Appalachian Trail, and that was just, for me, this incredible rite of passage to just do something that felt like something that I had chosen, something that I really wanted to do. Then I wound up coming back from the trail, and I didn't know what I was going to do. I was taking this gap year, and I started volunteering with a battered women's shelter. And I was working with these young kids, and a lot of them had been through, they'd witnessed a lot. They'd been through a lot of tough stuff. This one day, I was a volunteer. There was a child advocate who was working there, and she was always planning activities for the kids. And she took the kids to Mount Wachusett in Massachusetts. And for those who don't know, it's a small mountain. I think it's 2,006 feet, but it's this beautiful natural preserve with some of I think it's the most old growth forest in Massachusetts or something like that. But I remember seeing these kids who had been through, when I saw them in the shelter environment, a lot of times they would repeat things that they had heard and, swearing at each other, and just, it was really intense. Seeing them in nature, seeing them in that environment, all of a sudden they were curious, and they were like, they were playing, something transformed. And then in that moment, I just realized this had nothing to do with anything I was doing. I was just witnessing something almost like this healing power that was happening. I saw a huge shift in just their demeanor and everything. And that was, I really attribute, like, I don't know, a lot of people I think have a moment in their life when they can pinpoint, like, they feel like that's something makes sense. And it's like, that's what I want to do with my life. Yeah. And for me, that was that moment. It was just like, I knew. So originally I wanted to go into wilderness therapy, and then that kind of morphed into being a public school science teacher for about a decade. But all that time I really had in my head that I wanted to do something that wasn't so much teaching out of a textbook. And I did the best I could in the classroom setting, but I even, there was a few times I even pitched it to schools, like, oh, what if we could do this alternative kind of program? And I definitely felt like that was the moment where it kind of, I knew what I wanted to do.
That's beautiful. Beautiful. So you were an earth science teacher for a decade.
Yeah.
In the classroom.
Yeah.
And you've had that pivotal moment before that. And so then all of a sudden you are now changing course, and you've decided to make that dream come true that you had that many years before. So what was that crossroad like when you founded the Walden Project? And before, I guess, maybe explain what the Walden Project is.
I'll go back in time a little bit. So when I was a senior in college, it was 2005. And I went to, and at that time, I was really starting to know that I wanted to go down more of an education track. And I went to this conference on, I'm trying to remember if it was, I think it was an environmental education conference, if I'm remembering correctly, but it was in Quechee, Vermont. And I remember sitting in the conference and just kind of hearing all these ideas. And this one guy stood up at the conference and he described how he had started this program called the Walden Project in Vergennes, Vermont. And that guy was Matt Schlein. I remember listening to the details about it. And I was like, it's funny because I think there was a little bit of a naiveness where I was like, wow, I'm sure this is one of hundreds of programs like this. And I just, I'd love to, maybe someday I'll start something like this. And the deeper I got into education, I realized, oh, that was extremely rare, to find something like this. So anyway, in 2017, I called Matt Schlein and I said, I don't know if you remember me. We we met at a conference, years ago, and he did. And I said, I am really interested in starting a Walden Project. And so now to answer your question, what is the Walden Project and why is it unique? So the Walden Project is a full-time outdoor education experience for high school students. So the whole curriculum is kind of centered around Henry David Thoreau's experience at Walden Pond. And I'll assume that not everybody knows what happened with Henry David Thoreau. So way back in 1845, he decided he was going to leave society and go into the woods to kind of have a retreat in what he called a sojourn. Now, it's important to note that when he went into the woods, this was about a mile from his mom's house and, from the village of Concord. So, but that was kind of significant that it was never really about, he wasn't John Muir. He was just retreating from society. And what he was really trying to do is live by his values. He was an abolitionist, but when, everywhere, anything he wanted to buy was going to be somehow adding money to slavery and if supporting an economy fueled by slavery and immigrant labor. And at the time, it was especially Irish immigrants. He saw his government, doing things to try to expand slavery. He saw, the movements of society, and in his lifetime, he's witnessing the beginnings of the railroad and the telegraph and all, and industrialization. He's like, this isn't aligned with what I really want. And meanwhile, he's reading the works of Ralph Waldo Emerson and these ideas about finding a spirituality with nature, not just seeing it as a resource where, this is ours for the taking. So all these things are combining. He's 27 years old. And he decides, and actually the other really important event was that his brother just died, and he's deeply in grief after this experience. So with all this turmoil, and I certainly felt versions of that turmoil I can relate to, just living in this world and feeling like nothing is aligned with my values, he decided he's going to go and try what he called an experiment in living deliberately, where he's going to just see if he can live by his values. He did things that were kind of radical at the time, like experimenting with vegetarianism. He planted, he's growing his own food, but he would not use immigrant labor because he's like, part of my values is I'm not going to exploit anyone. He's trying to leave the economy in many ways. So he's doing all these things. And then he writes this famous book, Walden, about his experience. So that's kind of the backstory of why this, I think, is a cool model for especially teenagers to explore. We distill Thoreau's big ideas into 3 questions, and that is, what is my relationship to myself? What is my relationship to my culture? And what is my relationship to the natural world? And so those 3 questions are really at the center of our curriculum, and everything we do kind of branches off of that. And I think the beauty of it is that because those questions are obviously not standardized or anything, each student is coming to their own conclusion about, how they're going to answer those 3 questions for themselves. That's, I guess the thematic part. I can give you a little bit of the nitty gritty. So the nitty gritty is that the students come, it's 5 days a week. It's a day program. I'll start with the exciting.
And the students take a year off so they're high school students.
Yes. So I'd say about half of our students are coming from a conventional school, whether that's public or private. And then some of our students are homeschooled students. And then some of our students are doing this as a gap year after high school. Yeah.
So that within itself is, to me, absolutely incredible, to get this age group to really kind of replicate, in a sense, that experience that Walden had, and that you are creating this incredible environment that is so unusual, such an unusual offering for that particular age group. So I just thinking, I want our listeners to really think that these are high school students, and where high school students are in their lives. It's a fascinating thing for me. So go on.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right. I think that there are, and the year before I started this, it's actually as I was starting this program, I was working with a forest school program that's actually on the same site at Cumming Nature Center. And I am so thrilled and amazed by the number of programs that are just expanding for younger children. And we can talk a little bit more later about just sort of some of the obstacles and reasons why I think these are, it's a harder sell, I think, for older students, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a huge need and a huge benefit for teenagers to be able to have these experiences too.
Yeah. I think it's so important. So you were saying something along the lines of, to one of your philosophies being to teach a student and not necessarily a curriculum. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. That was a piece of advice that I got from one of my mentors, one of my high school teachers who I remain close with. He said, teach a student, not a curriculum. And I center my whole ideas around teaching based on that. I think that if we are putting this idea of, teaching to a test, teaching to standards as the center of the curriculum, which is, I think, what is happening primarily in conventional education settings, we are missing out on opportunities to build off of the curiosity of the students that are in front of us and the lived experience of the students who we're working with. I would say, so some of, there's a few different philosophies that I think are guiding the Walden Project. And one of them is Paulo Freire. It was funny. I asked Matt Schlein years after I started my Walden Project, and I said, so by the way, how did you start this? And he said, well, I read way too much Paulo Freire in college. And it was funny because that's who I did my thesis on as well.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I'll share, what I think of Paulo Freire in the way that I say it to the students. And with the students, our classroom area, if you want to call it that, it's outside, but it's right next to a pond. We sit down by the pond and I'll take a pebble and I'll toss it in the pond. And the ripples are kind of obviously, where the rock splashes in, the ripples kind of come outward. And to me, that's based on Paulo Freire's idea that you start with that spark of curiosity. You start with your experience of the world, and then you build off of it and it grows. And this is different from, what Paulo Freire described as the banking model of education, which is where, you have a authority figure, a teacher, a textbook, something like that. And he said that, in the conventional model, we're just depositing information in the heads of our students, and it really without their investment in terms of it's happening in a very passive way. With this idea of, building off of experiential learning, that's a huge guiding philosophy in what we're doing. And to me, that's about teaching a student, not a curriculum. It's building off of their experiences. And that's a huge part of what we're doing.
And then also what you said earlier in terms of, which was so interesting, when you felt like you were witnessing these students in Mount Wachusett, and that's becoming the facilitator. And even as a young person, just really realizing that sort of nature is actually one of our teachers and plays such a big role in that, and that we can, as educators and parents and homeschooler parents, and take a step back and really become those facilitators. And I love that's part of your philosophy of your program.
Oh, no, I was going to say my wife was the person who was one of the very first teachers across the street at the Forest School program. And I've learned so much from her about outdoor learning. And one of the things that really sticks with me that she said is that we need to not think of ourselves as teachers, and we need to think of ourselves as curators. And what she means by that is that when you go into a museum, you can tell that somebody set up that experience for you. They put the lighting in a certain way around the paintings, and they, or they have some kind of like flow and experience that you're having, but you are having your own experience. No one's telling you to walk this way or walk that way. And it's all about the setting that the curator has created for that learning to take place. And that the difference in the word between curator and teacher, to me, really sums up what I think is crucial about outdoor learning, outdoor education, nature-based learning, is this idea that, we're, like you said, we're the facilitators of this experience as opposed to the deliverers of that experience, or of that knowledge or something like that.
And also, I'd like to call them invitations for learning. So we're curating these invitations, and that's what they are. We're not saying, okay, go here, go there. This is what you got to do now, and this is how you have to do it, and this is what the product of what you're doing needs to look like, and all of that pieces. But it's more loose, it's free, it's on the child's time, and we create those invitations. So again, we curate. I love that word, curate. I'm going to be that's brilliant.
Yep.
Are there any practical tips and ideas that us educators can learn from your experience and your program that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, I'm definitely. I was kind of excited to talk about this because, like I said, I listen to your podcast all the time, and I love the ones where you'll have like 3 tips or 5 tips or whatever that those are really helpful. So I thought, well, if I'm ever on this podcast, I want to have some practical guidelines of things that people can steal and build on. So yeah, I guess the first thing I'll talk about is I in education, I had heard this phrase. It's not my own, but thinking about things in terms of ritual, novelty, and challenge. And so for us, the ritual is we have a daily routine that kind of sticks with us that we do just about every day that we're in the woods. So the daily routine is that the students arrive at 9:30. They're typically dropped off by their parents or a carpool or something like that. We walk uphill through the snow, and we eventually arrive at a ring of benches around a campfire. And the first part of the day is that everybody is kind of very busy. There's a lot of purpose. The students are chopping up vegetables for a vegetable soup or something like that. Some students are building a fire and splitting wood. Some students are, gathering materials. There's often when we're having our discussions and stuff, kids like to knit or something. So they might be, we have a little cabin up there. So they might be going and getting the things that they want to carve spoons or knit, something while they're, so they're getting all their stuff ready for the day. It's kind of an exciting time. The first part of our day is what we would call our Thoreau meeting. And we will read something, and oftentimes it's Thoreau, but it's not always. We also read like excerpts from Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. We have different units throughout the year. So when we're doing our ecology units, we read from a book called Water, A Natural History by Alice Outwater, or Reading the Forested Landscape by Tom Wessels, just a variety of different things. And then we'll just have this meandering discussion, which is the students, we have sort of some structures in place where, the first time we just go around, we just I always say we're going to find out what's alive in our group, and we'll pass around something and hear from each person, how they're responding to what we just read, what things they're curious about, what things they disagree with, or whatever their thoughts are. Then we have this very lively, robust discussion. And as we go, I'm often taking notes on the board and just trying to make that discussion and extract as much learning as we possibly can from it. The second part of our day is what we call dirt time. And that's an idea that I borrowed from John Young in his Coyote's Guide and Kamana work. And with dirt time, it's just basically somehow we're directly interacting with nature. It could be a hike. It could be going to sit spots. It could be working in the garden. Sometimes we'll have shelter building challenges or something like that too. And then the third part of our day, we'll have lunch. And lunch, like I said, it could be a vegetable soup that's been over the fire all morning, or pancakes or something like that. Then for the afternoon, we'll do a workshop. And the workshop is often guided by we have a theme. And so once we have a theme, so for example, one of our themes is called self-reliance. And with the self-reliance theme, we're really looking at ideas related to sustainability. And we examine this idea of what does it mean in our culture when we talk about something as disposable, and what's the opposite of disposable? So we make things from scratch, and we kind of examine, like, if you make, every student makes a knife with a blacksmith, for example. If you're going to make a knife, do you think of it the same way as a knife you bought for, $1.99 at Walmart or something like that? So it's just examining our relationship to things. That's just an example of one workshop. And then, our day ends at 3:30. So that's kind of like the ritual, the routine that we're in every day. The other parts of our routine, what I just described is what we do Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Mondays, we are at Finger Lakes Community College. Every Monday we have community meeting, and we have everything we do is based on consensus. And so that could be decisions about things like how are we going to do dishes. I've never met a group of students, teenagers or really even adults who can come up with a working system where there aren't resentments and things like that related to dishes. And that's part of the program, is like allowing students to work that out. We do a thing every Monday called Life Story, and each week one person tells their life story, and that's a really powerful experience where even students might not always like each other, but they will, when you hear where somebody's coming from, you feel like a deeper level of empathy and compassion for, their story and what their experience is. And then the final part of our
again at that age. Sorry to interrupt. I just keep going to we're talking about high school students. So go back. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, then they're in the library for the last part of our day. But life story, that's one of the things, like, when I started Walden, Matt Schlein said, just make this your own. But if you're going to do one thing the same as us in Vermont, he said, life story is like the glue. And I think he's totally right. It's one of the most powerful things that we do. And then every Friday we do service learning. So the students don't come to our program. They go off into the community and they all have an internship. So we'll often say to the students, what's a problem that you care about in the world? What's a thing that maybe keeps you up at night or something that you just feel like it's not right? And yeah, students will try to hook them up with an organization that's doing that kind of work. It could be working on issues related to poverty at a homeless shelter or something like that. Environmental issues, working on a campaign for, climate justice, or maybe working on an organic farm or something. A lot of students, they want to work with rescuing animals in the shelter or something like that too. So, yeah.
Just amazing. It's amazing because it's the scope and the depth is incredible to think about. And I keep going back and I'm like, these are these young people that are really in that process of finding out who they are. And I can't imagine a better place and a better experience for them to have. And I'm so grateful that you are offering this opportunity and all the components that you've added to it, like the life stories, and you've really thought through every single piece. And so it's not a program where they spend the night. It's a day program. So they come to you and it ends at 3:30 and they go back and they come each day.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Can you share some of the challenges? I mean, you've been at this, for how many years at the Walden
We're about
Project?
to enter our 7th year.
Seventh year.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of learning that happens in 7 years.
Yeah.
Challenges, and nothing is easy. And I think oftentimes we learn the most when we are given the biggest challenges. And one of the reasons why I love this podcast so much is that we can pull from each other's stories and help each other along in this journey. And if there are other folks that are working with older children and youth, and what challenges, what lessons, what nugget can you share with us to help us along?
The first thing I think is giving the students some vocabulary around this. And so we talk about being in your comfort zone, your stretch zone, or your panic zone. And what I always say is that learning only happens in your stretch zone. This was an idea, one of my former co-teachers named Jordan Miller was sharing this with us, and it became like a sort of founding idea of our program. But yeah, we want students to be in their stretch zone, and we're saying, if you're stuck in your comfort zone, you're not going to learn anything, and if you dip into your panic zone, you're not going to be able to focus either. So we want to encourage everybody to kind of stay there. I'd say, some practical tips. One is that I think that there's a huge value in allowing students to work through their challenging conflicts with support, as long as they're in the stretch zone. And so sometimes that might mean, sometimes I have this tendency that I want to, when there's a conflict or a problem, I just want to solve it, right? I just want to say, okay, let's just do the dishes this way. But that's robbing the students of the value of that. And sometimes that means sitting with some of that discomfort and the conflict that's happening. The same thing, like when students are working through being outside in the cold, there's an enormous value in like learning like that resilience. If a student is kind of in that panic zone with that, or I think it's about making that the primary focus of my attention in that moment, is not necessarily jumping in and rescuing and be like, okay, let's just go inside and, but more just like making sure that we're definitely not risking anyone's safety, but really trying, a lot of times I'll stop what I'm doing and we're going to boil some water and put it in hot water bottles and get them in a sleeping bag. And I'll, 9 times out of 10, they're all of a sudden, they're like 10 minutes later, they're peeling off layers and they're not in the panic zone anymore because they've warmed up. I would say other advice that I would say is that, I guess, really practical advice. When you're outside, out of that, so in a classroom setting, a lot of times I feel like it's insulated from the real world in many ways. It's insulated certainly from the elements and nature, but a lot of times teachers will avoid allowing students to actually talk about what's really going on for them because, they're really focused on the curriculum and the process that we all have to do in that setting. When you're outside, stuff can come up. And I think it's because you're in that setting that sometimes things that people have been carrying around for many years, all of a sudden they have the peace and quiet of wilderness, and all of a sudden they're talking about it for the first time. And what I would say is I am really clear with our parents. I am not trained as a therapist, and I need to know that capacity. This is not therapy. And there are times when I've been in over my head when something's coming up for a student, and I have a plan in place to make sure, okay, I have consultants who are social workers, and I'll say, okay, this is what's going on in this situation. What numbers do we call? What numbers do we give the students? How do we handle this with the parents? Things like that. That's really important. The other thing I think is really important in terms of challenges is there are certain, I'd say, core principles of our program that we want everybody to be trained in. So one of the things is, just on a practical level, every one of our students and staff has wilderness first aid training. And so we all know the signs of hypothermia. We all know, I think sometimes just for students who are going to be using an axe, to visualize, okay, if I did do something stupid and I was taking this big risk, what would be the steps? Like all of a sudden I'm involving ambulances and things like that. And in my experience, I think that just thinking through that with the students, and they're doing these scenarios and that training, I think that changes the way that I don't see as many teenagers doing dumb stuff with knives and axes that I think that I always say I want students to have accidents, but I want an accident to be, something they can fix with a Band-Aid and not with an ambulance ride. Yes, exactly. And then same thing. We train everybody in our program in nonviolent communication. That's a huge, huge guiding principle of our program. And I think that when conflicts do arise, there's similar trainings, there's alternatives to violence and other things that are similar sort of, ways of responding to issues that come up. But students are not so in the dark about, like, you don't want to get into a situation where there's suddenly there's a conflict that's arising and students go into that fight or flight of, oh no, I'm in trouble. But if you prevent a lot of that by just talking through conflicts throughout the whole year about little things like, dishes, then when bigger things come up, the students don't go to that sort of defensive place, and they can come to it like, okay, I'm going to try to understand the needs and the feelings of the people who are in this community, not because I'm a bad person, but because this was coming up for this person. Just as an example, a couple years ago, when you're sitting around with almost anybody, but especially teenagers, and you're talking about philosophy, one of the go-to things a lot of students will go to is Hitler. They'll say, if we were in, if we don't do this, then it's going to be like Hitler, and it's going to be, that's like a shorthand almost for like the devil or something in a lot of people's minds. And we had, some students who were in our group who their families were Jewish and from Israel. And they were saying, like, I understand what you're saying. You're talking about, you're trying to say like a despotic bad guy. But when you keep using this specific example, it's actually making me kind of uncomfortable. And for the students, rather than getting on their digging in and to just hear the needs and feelings of the other person that's talking, and not be like defensive and not be like, I'm a bad person, or you're saying I'm a bad person, it changes the way that the conflicts can happen. Yeah. And again, like you were saying, this is teenagers. And I find so often that our teenagers who are really practicing this handle so many things so much better than a lot of adults that I encounter, especially when you read like comment sections on the internet or something like that. Like our students.
You've created a space where they're building this muscle, and it's any muscle or any type of behavior. You need to repeat it and do it over and try it out, and what works and what doesn't work, and adjust and tweak. And I feel like this incredible program that you have is a gift to these kids that they can practice. It's a safe place where they can practice these skills, when oftentimes when kids are in the public school system or traditional schools, they're so, again, like you said earlier, they're so focused on the academics and getting through the standards that the social emotional piece of their development, which is enormous, especially at that age, is kind of ignored. So it's such a great example of building that muscle and having a space that you've created where you've cultivated a space where they can do that safely. So that, I love that.
I feel that way too. And one thing I did want to say too, one of the things I love about your podcast is that I feel like there's many lanes in this movement. And for the public school teacher who's like building an outdoor classroom, or they're like creating an outdoor garden, or they're taking their biology class into a wetland and they're collecting data, like I just think it's the importance of giving students an opportunity to be outside and have that space to connect. It's all in the same movement, and we all have a different lane. And so, yeah, I just wanted to say I feel a great solidarity with all the people who are doing this kind of work.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you couldn't have said it better. And no, regardless of where you are, it's just the reminder of that we do need to build that social emotional piece, because that complements everything else. And if that's out of whack, then like you said earlier, it just needs to be balanced, and cultivating and creating these invitations for learning, and all of that sort of goes into that. The last thing you said here was the answer is yes. The question is how. I would love to finish up with that if you can describe that a little bit.
Well, sure. I'd say what I think about with that is when I decided to leave the public school system and do this thing that was, for me, it was almost like a low speed midlife crisis or something like that, where I was just like, I could see myself being like, okay, I could keep doing what I'm doing and be reasonably happy, but like you only get to live once. And this is this thing that I've always felt like in my experiences doing outdoor education. Sometimes you're doing something that's like, yeah, this is what I have an instinct that is just like, this is my talent. This is like what I really want to do, is what I feel compelled to do. So in starting this, my first few tours of the site that we wanted to do the Walden Project in, I had to like say to the students and their parents who were checking out the program, like, can you imagine if there was a garden right here? And can you imagine if we had a fire pit right here? And then as starting from there and kind of building this thing, there's always obstacles. And so I would say the three obstacles that we encounter the most, one is tuition. So we're a tuition-based program, and I never wanted this to be like an elite program. But even then, having a program where people are having to pay out of pocket is an obstacle for a lot of people. So we've done, then it's like, okay, I want this student to be able to come. How can we do this? We've done a lot of fundraising and created a scholarship program. We've looked at different ways of just trying to find that accessibility. Transportation is a big one too, because we have I would say half of our students are coming from 10, 15-minute drives, but we have the other half that's coming from an hour away. And then occasionally we've had a couple students who are driving from an hour and a half away. And there's these obstacles, and we want these students to be able to have this experience. What can we do? And just say, okay, well, and sometimes it's like helping parents setting up carpools or trying out different things. For a little while, I had a 15-passenger van, and I hired somebody to drive back and forth, but that didn't work out financially, so we couldn't do that anymore. And then, the third thing that comes up a lot too is academics. And so we were encountering that, especially with high school, and this is maybe helpful for some of your listeners. Even in elementary school, I know that the kids who are doing school programs for one day a week or something like that, they encounter some resistance from the school, because it's like, well, we need to cover all this information. And in high school, it's even more intense because, students have to be able to graduate. So we are actually now able to offer college credit for this experience. So we worked with Finger Lakes Community College. The students are getting 10 college credits for this experience, and trying to make this, we want to do this really innovative, exciting program. And it's one of the obstacles is like the academic side of it, making sure students aren't choosing Walden instead of a diploma or something like that. I guess that's the thing I wanted to say too to anybody listening, is that I didn't know any of this stuff when I started. It was really just, okay, here's another obstacle. I'm not going to let this get in the way. It's just now we got to get creative and think about how are we going to find a way for any one of these obstacles to not prevent somebody from being able to do this. And, even this year, it's every summer, it's starting over in terms of like finding a new group of students to come and trying to work out some of these problems. And it gets easier as time goes on because you have more tools in your toolbox, but it only came from that attitude of like, all right, well, there's a million reasons why this shouldn't work, but we're just going to approach each one with that attitude of like, okay, the question is just how are we going to make it work?
I love that. I'm going to steal that from you. The answer is yes. The question is how. It's just absolutely brilliant. And it really speaks to your whole program, the philosophy of Walden. It speaks to so much of what you're doing. And I want to thank you for the work that you are doing and the lives that you are touching, and not only the children's lives, but their families, and just that ripple effect that you have been creating. So I want to thank you for that. Is there anything else that you would like to share with our community? And if not, can you let us know where we can find you?
Well, I can answer the second one first, which is we are at rmsc.org/Walden. So when I started this, I started as a sole proprietor, but then a couple years in, one of the things that was one of those, how can we make this better? We are now part of Cumming Nature Center, which has a lot more stability than me trying to do this by myself. And that's been an amazing change. So anyway, that's our website address. And then the second thing I would just say, I guess just what to share with your listeners. I really appreciate what you're doing with this podcast, Victoria. And I've learned so much from the other episodes. It's giving me ideas. And I think because we're all part of this, I think the one thing that all of your listeners, including me, have in common is that we are in many ways going against the flow of what the current education system is. And I think we need to see ourselves as radical, and we need to support each other, because just because you make a mistake or something like that, like, don't give up. We learn from our mistakes, and hopefully by sharing in a community like, this one that you've created, by learning from each other's mistakes and solutions, we all benefit. Yeah, I think that it makes us less likely to fail if we feel like we have a community of support that we can safely talk to these other folks and learn what they're doing.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that we are stronger together, and I think we are in a movement. And it's exciting to see that it's growing and that more people are thinking this way. And I think it's an act of, we need to save ourselves, and we also need to save our world, our earth, because it's a lot of things that are happening with that. So I just want to thank you so much for the kind words. And I also want to thank you for all the work that you are doing. And you are in New York, right?
Naples, New York. It's like south of Rochester, right in the Finger Lakes.
Beautiful, beautiful. So again, I want to direct people in your direction. And again, we are here to support you in any which way that we can. So let me know. And again, thank you for all the work that you're doing and reaching out. And just, it's exciting for me because I do think we do a lot of talk with early childhood and preschool, and that there's a lot of energy around that. So I love having the spotlight on our youth and our high school students. So thank you again for putting that energy into the world. And
thanks a lot, Victoria. I really appreciate the encouragement. And again, back at you.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. If you found value, please share this episode with your fellow educators. Remember, our Circle membership includes access to our full library of workshops, live sessions, book club, outdoor teaching tour and talks, plus the seasonal masterclasses and outdoor teaching boot camp, all for just $27 a month. It's your all-in-one resource for professional development in teaching outdoors. And don't miss out on our capstone course, essential for completing the Outdoor Teacher Certification Program, available separately at an early bird price at $450. Visit Outdoor-Classrooms.com, the hub for your professional development needs in outdoor education. Until next time, continue to inspire and transform education by bringing the classroom outdoors.